Okay, here we go with Who Was Rosa Parks? Pine Level, Alabama, 1919. Every morning, Rosa Parks walked to school. Every afternoon, she walked back home again. There was no school bus to her school. She didn't mind the walk, she was used to it. Often, she saw a big yellow school bus roll past her, but the bus never stopped for her. All the children inside were white. It was taking them to a school that was for whites only. Rosa was black. Rosa grew up in Pine Level, Alabama. At that time, in the South, black people and white people led separate lives. All of Rosa's friends and family were black. She hardly knew any white people. How could she? Black people weren't allowed in the same restaurants or hotels. They could not swim in public schools with white people or drink from the same water fountain. Can you imagine? Every time she saw a bus carrying white children to and from school, it made her feel like black children didn't matter as much as white children. Sometimes the white children threw trash out the windows, trying to hit the black children. After a while, Rosa and the other black children stopped walking by the road. They went through the fields instead. The school for the white children was nicer too. It had real glass panes in the windows. At Rosa's school, there was no glass, only shutters. Still, Rosa knew inside that she was as good as any white child. She was as good as anyone, and one day she'd prove it. Chapter 1, Down on the Farm. Rosa Louise Macaulay was born in Tuskegee, Alabama on February 4th, 1913, almost her birthday, 3 more days. Her father, James, was a carpenter. Her mother, Leona, was a teacher. Rosa was small for her age. She was often sick with a sore throat. She had to spend a lot of time in bed. When Rosa was about 2.5, her mother and father separated. Rosa moved to Pine Level, just outside Montgomery, Alabama. There, she lived on her grandparents' farm with her mother and her little brother, Sylvester. She liked to farm. With her family around, she felt safe and secure. Beyond the farm, the world was not such a safe place. Some white people living nearby belonged to a group called the Ku Klux Klan. They wore white robes and hoods to cover their faces. Many times, the Klan members set fire to houses where black people lived or churches where they prayed. The police did nothing to stop the attacks. Is this the Ku Klux Klan? Or KKK as it's known, is a hate group that uses threats and violence against blacks and other minorities. The name probably came from the Greek word kuklos, meaning circle. The Ku Klux Klan was a circle or band of brothers, Tennessee veterans, of the Confederate Army founded the Klan after the Civil War ended in 1865. Groups soon spread throughout the South. Klan members wore white robes and pointed hats with masks to hide their faces. Often, they left burning crosses in front of the victims' homes. During the 1920s, when Rosa was a child, the Klan spread throughout the country. At one point, there were about 4 million members in the United States. Today, thankfully, that number is down to about 5,000. When Klan members marched by Rosa's house, her grandfather stood at the door. He held a shotgun in his hand. Some nights he slept in a rocking chair, the shotgun in his lap. Rosa often stayed curled up beside him. Even whites who didn't belong to the Ku Klux Klan could be cruel. A wealthy planter named Moses Hudson would hire black children to pick and chop cotton. He paid them 50 cents a day. The children usually didn't wear shoes. And the hot ground burned their bare feet so badly that they would pick cotton on their knees. If any got blood on the cotton, they would be whipped. Here's a little thing called Jim Crow laws. In the southern United States, from 1876 to 1965, Jim Crow laws kept separation of blacks and whites in public facilities. Blacks could not buy houses in white neighborhoods or eat at the same restaurants as white people. They even had to bring their clothes to all black laundromats. The term Jim Crow probably comes from minstrel shows of the late 1800s. White men would wear black face makeup and make fun of African Americans. Jim Crow was the name of a character in minstrel show skits. Back to Rosa. Even so, Rosa did not mistrust all white people. There was an old white woman in Pine Level who used to take her bass fishing. This woman was kind and polite to Rosa and her grandparents. She treated them as equals. There was a nice white soldier who always patted her on the head whenever he came through town. Even a small gesture like this was unusual. As she grew older, Rosa began to pity the whites who called her names or threw rocks at her. She wanted to forgive, not hate, people who insulted her. Much of the time, Rosa was happy in Pine Level. She loved school. She couldn't wait for each day to begin. She enjoyed Mother Goose nursery rhymes, playing hide and seek with her friends, and looking after her younger brother. She liked to explore the woods, creeks, and ponds near the farm, but she was always careful to avoid poisonous snakes. For extra pocket money, she sold eggs to the neighbors. Sometimes she wandered into the local cemetery. Some of the tombstones dated back to the Civil War. At the end of the Civil War in 1865, slavery ended. From then on, it was against the law for a person to own another person. Some of Rosa's grandparents had been slaves. Now, even though they were poor and often mistreated, Rosa's family was free. Here's a little segment here called Brown versus Board of Education, Supreme Court case. As a black child living in the South, Rosa Parks could not attend school with white children. Then, in 1954, a group of black parents in Topeka, Kansas, went to court to end school segregation. Their case is one of the most famous ever to come before the Supreme Court. The black parents were upset because the all-black school was over a mile away from their neighborhood. It was a long trip for young children. The all-white elementary school was very close by it. It was unfair that their children could not go there. Up to this point, the law said public schools could stay segregated as long as the black schools were as good as the white schools. But now the judges on the Supreme Court changed the law. From here on in, separate schools for black children and white children were illegal. Public schools had to be integrated. Black children could go to any public school they wished. Chapter 2, City Lights. In 1924, when Rosa was 11, her mother sent her to live with relatives in Montgomery, the Alabama state capital, so she could go to a better school. It was called the Montgomery Industrial School for Girls. The school had been started by white Northerners to help poor black girls. There were 250 to 300 students. All the teachers were white women from the North. The head of the school, Alice White, was both strict and loving. She expected a lot from her girls. Rosa adored her. From Miss White, Rosa learned to respect herself. She would not set low goals for herself just because she was black. Rosa was excited to be in Montgomery. To her, it seemed like a big, modern city. Early cars, Model Ts crowded the streets. There were fine shops filled with fancy dresses, hats, and gloves. A football stadium seated 12,000 people. Trains on the Louisville and Nashville railroad lines came charging into Union Station, and riverboats brought their cargo of pine and cotton to the wharf. But in some ways, Montgomery was just like Pine Level. One day, Rosa was walking through a white neighborhood. A white boy on roller skates sped by and slammed into her. He was trying to shove her off the sidewalk. She turned and pushed him back. The boy's mother was standing nearby. She told Rosa that she could be put in jail for what she had done, forever. In Rosa Parks' My Story, Rosa later wrote, "So I told her that he had pushed me and that I did not want to be pushed. Seeing that I wasn't bothering him at all, she wanted to stand up for herself, and she did." Rosa spent 4 years at Miss White's school. Many whites in Montgomery resented Miss White and the other teachers. What business did they have teaching black children? Why didn't they just stay up north where they were from? Twice the school was set on fire. In 1928, it was forced to close. Miss White went back home to Massachusetts. However, she stayed in touch with Rosa, who considered her a loving teacher and dear friend. After that, Rosa attended an all-black school. She was hoping to become a teacher like her mother. Then her grandmother got sick. Rosa, who was 16, dropped out of school and moved back to Pine Level to help care for her. After her grandmother died, Rosa's mother became ill. Rosa was there to help. She was not happy about leaving school, but she did not complain. To make money, she cleaned houses for white people. Sometimes that wasn't enough. She'd stand on the street selling fruit. Rosa worked hard. She also belonged to the St. Paul AME Church. AME stands for African Methodist Episcopal. The church was in the old black neighborhood in Montgomery. It was the center of Rosa's life and brought her great joy. Her strong faith helped her to get through her long, tiring days. Here's this section called The Role of the Black Church. The first black churches were formed before 1800 by free blacks in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Petersburg, Virginia, and Savannah, Georgia. The churches began because blacks were not welcome at many white churches. In their own churches, blacks developed a brand of Christianity that drew on African spiritual customs. The churches became centers of their communities. The churches founded schools and helped the poor and those in prison. In the 1960s, the churches were a very important part of the civil rights movement. Their minister became civil rights leaders. Martin Luther King Jr. was a minister, so was Jesse Jackson. Back to Rosa. The church taught her not to complain or rebel. Instead, she was to place her faith in God. God would take care of her. God would provide. But then she met a bright young man named Raymond Parks. Raymond had a lot of different ideas. Chapter 3, Life with Raymond. Rosa was 18 when she met Raymond. He was 28 and working at a barber shop in Montgomery. A friend introduced them. Rosa was impressed by how smart he was. Raymond hadn't had much schooling, but he loved learning. Raymond had suffered through hard times too. Like Rosa's father, Raymond's father had been a carpenter. He had died falling from a roof when Raymond was a little boy. His mother, who had taught him to read and write, died when he was a teenager. Since then, Raymond had been on his own. Raymond talked a lot about the lives of blacks in the South. He was one of the first members of the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. People liked and respected him. When Raymond and Rosa met, he was upset about a trial in Scottsboro, Alabama. 9 black teenagers were accused of attacking 2 white women on a train. The evidence against the boys was faked. The women were lying. Still, the jury convicted 8 of the 9 boys. They were all sentenced to death, except for the youngest. He was only 12. Later, most of the sentences were lifted. However, the 8 boys served at least 6 years in prison for a crime they had not committed. Raymond Parks could not stop thinking about this case. In fact, he could have been killed for his efforts to bring attention to the Scottsboro boys. Rosa was proud by Raymond's courage, and she was proud of him. On their first date, Raymond took Rosa for a ride in his shiny red sports car. On their second date, he proposed. Second date! He proposed. 2 years later, in December 1932, they were married in Pine Level. The couple moved to Montgomery, not far from Alabama State University. Raymond continued his work for the Scottsboro boys. He held meetings in the park's front room. Rosa never forgot the first meeting. The men brought guns. They felt they needed to protect themselves. What they were doing was dangerous. Rosa sat on the back porch, her face buried in her lap. It made Rosa sad that black men feared for their lives just because they were holding a meeting. Still, her husband's work spurred her on. Raymond wanted Rosa to go back to school, and she did. In 1934, she earned her high school diploma. At this time, hardly any black people in Montgomery were high school graduates, not even 1 in 10. Rosa was proud to be among the small number of blacks who did have a degree. Yet she was still unable to find work that really challenged her. Instead, she took a job at a hospital as a nurse's assistant. She also did sewing on the side. Then in 1941, she got a job as a secretary at an Army Air Force base in Montgomery called Maxwell Field. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had forbidden segregation at all United States military bases, so Maxwell Field was integrated. Blacks and whites worked together. But when Rosa left the base, she had to ride home on a segregated bus. Black had to sit in the back. It was unfair, and it made her deeply angry. Rosa Parks was a quiet person, but the anger lived inside her, growing day by day. Soon it became so large, she knew she would have to do something about it. Chapter 4, The Call to Action. Raymond was growing frustrated with the NAACP. He dropped out in 1943. He thought that the educated men in charge did not understand the needs of working-class black men like him. But that same year, Rosa decided to join the NAACP. She went to the first meeting, hoping to see Johnny May Carr, an old friend from Miss White's school. Johnny May was not there that evening. Rosa stayed anyway, because she was the only woman in the room. She was asked to take notes. For the next 12 years, Rosa served as a secretary for the NAACP in Montgomery. She was one of the few women in the civil rights movement during the 1940s. Her boss was a man named Edgar Daniel Nixon, E.D. Nixon. Nixon worked as a porter on a train. He traveled all over the country. He saw how different life was for black people in the North. Nixon wanted that kind of integration in the South, too. That was his dream. He believed strongly in the rights of black people. But did he care about women's rights? No. Nixon believed that women should stay in one place, the kitchen. Rosa's quick answer, "What about me?" made him laugh. Rosa was an excellent secretary. She typed notes, wrote letters, and organized meetings. Rosa let people know about hateful crimes against black people, beatings and lynchings. She helped find lawyers for black people accused of crimes they did not commit. Rosa also helped black people register to vote. Registering means getting your name on a list of voters in your district, so on election day, you can vote. Voting is one of the most basic rights in a democracy. Voting is the way to show who you want in office and what laws you want passed. Yet, of the 50,000 black people living in Montgomery, only 31 out of 50,000 were registered to vote. And some of those people, some of the 31, were dead. So Rosa decided to change things, starting with herself. She was going to register to vote. It was not easy to do. The registration office was only open during certain hours. These were hours when most people worked. Next, she had to take a reading test. This test was only given to black people, not whites, and it was not really about reading. It was a long, hard test about rules of government. Most people would not be able to answer the questions. Rosa took the test 3 times before she passed. The day her registration came in the mail, she was very excited, but she still could not vote yet. She had to pay a poll tax. According to Alabama law, at age 21, voters had to start paying a tax of $1.50 per year to vote. Rosa was now 32. That means she owed 11 years of poll taxes, or $16.50. That doesn't sound like a lot of money, but in 1945, a movie ticket might cost 10 cents. An ice cream cone, 5 cents. $16.50 was a lot of money. Still, Rosa paid it. When an election came, she cast her vote for Alabama's governor. Rosa was thrilled, but she was angry too. Getting the right to vote had been long, hard, and expensive. Many black people would not be able to get past all the hurdles. She knew that voting was a way black people could improve their lives. With the vote, she declared, we would have a voice. In order for that voice to be heard, it needed to become louder. It was not enough that Rosa could vote. Other blacks living in the South needed to vote. Rosa Parks was determined to help them become registered voters. All right, so that's halfway through the book. So I'll do one more video for this book tomorrow.